Okay, I'm going to try and keep things on track here for the benefit of everybody at the conference. On behalf of everyone who has worked to make this conference a success, I welcome you to the afternoon of InfoSec. Looks like we're going to have a nice intimate group here, which ought to work out well for the discussion portion of what we're talking about here. I called this talk More Risky Business. I did a talk here at InfoSec last year describing about why one would want to go about doing risk assessments, what the business motivation behind that is. And the point is that successful organizations are going to prevent problems by anticipating them. And I think risk assessments help you anticipate these problems. And will I wait my computer to crank up here? All right. As we just heard in our lunchtime talk, we only have usually a limited amount of resources to spend on security. So you need to be able to prioritize these things. And as Mr. Kennedy talked about, a risk assessment is one of your classic methods for being able to prioritize these resources. Now, like I talked about last year, I talked about why you want to do this sort of stuff. And some of the reasons I've listed here on this slide, so we're not going to go over that too much. This year, we're going to talk more about some of the actual specific questions that you need to ask, and in particular, how these would fit into one of the popular frameworks, the NIST framework. Now, all of these frameworks for doing risk assessments, the NIST, COVID, Octave, they all are address pretty much the same sort of thing. And I've also found that some people seem to work better by starting in with showing a real-life example as opposed to simply telling me about how wonderful things are going to be if I actually use these risk assessments. So that was another part of my motivation for kind of giving a more talk about the mechanics going into this process. So, I do need to review some key concepts of risk management here, though. You need to be aware that when we talk about risk, what we mean is that this is some function of an unwanted event and the likelihood, an unwanted effect of an event, rather, and the likelihood of that effect occurring. And you put those two things together, and that's how you're going to calculate a risk surrounding whatever it is that you're looking at. We'll get to that in just a moment. The primary factors that you're going to be looking at are the threat. Now, the threat is the instigator of bad things. This is what gets things started. And in order for the threat to actually cause a bad effect, you've got to have a vulnerability, something that that threat can take advantage of. Then there's the effect. This is what happens after the threat has taken advantage of the vulnerability. That's the bad thing that you don't want to have happen. The likelihood, which is the chance of the effect happening due to the combination of the vulnerability and the threat. So you see all this stuff works together. And then finally, another big factor that's always the case in risk is the uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty about how we calculate this sort of stuff, what sort of factors come into play. And you just need to bear in mind that's an important part of any risk evaluation. So, just to be sure that, I'll go back and look at this one more time. We've got the threat, vulnerability, the effect, the likelihood, and the uncertainty. So we're going to start out, for the purposes of today's class, with a fairly simple example. Okay? The threat. This is the interactive part. The dog. Very good. Very good. That's what could potentially, anyway, instigate the bad thing that could happen. Now, what's the most obvious vulnerability that we might see here? The hole in the fence. Yes, that is a great group. Okay. And what would be the effect, the bad thing that you don't want to happen? Yeah, the dog getting out, or or you getting bit. Maybe the dog is in the yard and you're outside walking down the sidewalk, and we don't want to get bit by that dog, so that would be that. Okay, likelihood. Okay, now we've identified the threat being the dog, the vulnerability being the hole in the fence, the effect either being the dog runs away or you get bit, depending on which side of the fence you're on. What's the likelihood? How well the fence was built. That might have something to do with the likelihood of the dog getting out through the hole in the fence.
The demeanor of the dog.
Demeanor of the dog, very good. That would be another factor determining likelihood. Size of the dog. Can the dog actually fit through that hole? That one's very good, because then we might be able to say likelihood is 0. I mean, that dog could be a lot fatter than its head looks, and its head's no way it's going to fit through the hole in that fence. What we would look at when we're trying to identify, now you notice some of the answers that we got for likelihood were not as straightforward as the ones we had for threat, vulnerability, and effect. Those were pretty cool. For likelihood, it was kind of like, oh. So the sorts of things we might need to look at for the likelihood would be, has the dog ever gotten out before? We can look at some historicals, or depending on which side of the fence you're on, has the dog ever bitten anybody before? Can it fit through the hole? That's very good. And as we saw, when we start getting down to the likelihood, that's where a lot of these uncertainty questions start to come in. Okay, so specifically, I'm going to talk about the NIST risk management process here. This is a 4-part process. It was put together by, the federal government before they all went on furlough, so that they could give you some guidelines as to how to go about doing risk management in IT and then risk assessments, which we're going to get into. It's easily found out there. I mean, you can just Google it, you can download it. I think it's 800-53 and 800-30 are the 2 documents that we'll be referring to mostly here today. And they are a little on the wordy side. I'm hoping to kind of boil down some of this and give you some of the key points, but the idea is so that when you go back and look at the NIST documents, you'll be able to say, okay, yeah, this is where Conrad said such and such, and this is kind of where this is where the dog came in, this is where the whole offense was, and that sort of thing. Now, the NIST risk management, it's a 4-part process. Now, this first process, called framing risk, Mr. Kennedy, he didn't call it that, but he kind of alluded to this in the sense of that this defines how your organization is going to have to relate to risk. Now, this is a very important process. I'll put in a shameless plug here. If any of you have seen the high risk, low risk applications talk, where I show how the risk management and risk assessment process can go horribly awry. You can see why this is very important, and I highly recommend that you read about this first process in any risk management framework when you go to do your risk assessments. But that's not what we're going to focus on today. Today we are going to focus on the risk assessment portion. The framing of the risk is also usually set for you by your management or your risk management organization already. So hopefully within your group you've already got some direction on that. If you're starting from absolute ground zero, well, my recommendation is give this some thought, go in and do a few examples. This is going to be an iterative process for you. Okay, moving ahead to the NIST risk assessment portion. You prepare for the assessment, you conduct the assessment, you communicate the results, and you maintain the assessment over time. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. It's probably the most straightforward thing I've ever seen out of the federal government, any guideline from the federal government in my life. I will throw in a couple of cautionary notes there. Remember the business about the uncertainty. These risk assessments are often not precise measures. And I think that risk assessments, you need to be careful not to overwork these things. There was another talk earlier today about the breadth and the depth of looking at your security efforts. And I think as IT people, we tend to get involved in looking at them deeply and not able to step back and actually see the forest for the trees. So when it comes time to doing your risk assessment, you bear that in mind. That's just something I've seen with risk assessments more than once, is that people tend to get deep on one particular topic. Sometimes that's appropriate, generally only in the more advanced organizations. So for the purposes as we go through today, I'm going to suggest that we be thinking about e-commerce, because just about everybody here, if you're going into Boston, they can probably stick your credit card number in there. And so we'll be thinking about, let's say we have a company and we've been selling our widgets, in our brick and mortar store for a long time. We've even been selling our widgets over the phone for a while. And, we heard about this thing called the internet. And so we've decided we're finally in 2013, we're going to jump on the bandwagon here, and we're going to start selling our widgets online. So we're going to think about what sort of new risks might we encounter when we go to sell our widgets online. And then, what might we do about those risks? Now, again, as you might expect, you need to prepare for the assessment when you get cranked up here. You need to identify the purpose of the assessment and the scope of the assessment. Generally, risk assessments address the potential harm that can occur to your business or organization. And as a consequence, your risk assessment is going to support decisions that are going to mitigate that risk or lower the likelihood or the effect that harm occurred. But risk assessments can also help you make decisions about disaster recovery, business continuity, and other related sorts of areas. As far as the scope is concerned, don't bite off more than you can chew, particularly if you're getting started in this fairly early on, because like I say, otherwise you're going to end up finding yourself funneling your risk assessment down to where you're just looking at so little that's not going to be producing particularly useful results. Start small, don't try and solve the risk assessment for your entire corporation if you're just getting started with this sort of thing. Also, before you start digging into your risk assessment, identify your assumptions and constraints. What sort of threat sources are you going to consider? Now, Mr. Kennedy talked after lunch about this business. You have these external wild west sort of things that your users on the inside. And I agree with him there. One thing that he didn't highlight, though, is that not all of your threat sources are going to be what the NIST standard calls adversarial. Somebody who's delivered the communication. Some of it is going to be accidental, non-adversarial in NIST terminology. Just mistakes, just dumb things happen. And those dumb things, have a non-zero likelihood, and they can have a harmful effect on your company. And I think they are not to be discounted. Generally, when you do a risk assessment, you should also consider, the dumb things happening as well as these deliberate things going on. And then also look at some existing conditions. We all operate within certain constricting parameters. Is there a particular information systems architecture that your IT department decided on 30 years ago, and still has to be done? There's a particular vendor that you're required to use. Is there a particular physical location that your servers have to be in? That room down in the basement where it water drips in every time it rains. Things of that sort. One of my favorite examples of looking at existing conditions and threats, these pre-existing constraints, has to do with the Wicked Witch of the West. We all remember that the Wicked Witch of the West had a problem with water. He was splashing with water, and she melted and disappeared. And yet, what did she have in buckets lying around the castle? You would think, the first thing she would have gotten rid of. No, okay, that was one of the pre-existing conditions that she had to deal with, where there were buckets of water laying around her castle. this is another key point here that I don't think enough people give enough thought to, and that is the orientation of the risk assessment that they're going to be performing. Frequently, you will see these threat-oriented risk assumptions or risk assessments. And if you were at DerbyCon last weekend, I know there were at least 2 talks, probably more, where they dealt with this particular way of looking at how to perform this risk assessments. And you had these companies out there, and they had these, I can't remember what they were called, they were called kill factors or something like that. They had all these points, and there was this other fellow who would take the various portions of the threat, and he was plotting them on a graph and drawing these lines, and then it had this 3D thing that would rotate out in space to show you how the various threats were going to be affecting your company. And if that works for your company, that's great, okay? But I would say that's, let's just back off, man. That's a bit much for most of the sorts of things that we're working on here today. If you don't really know exactly what the specific threat that you're going to be focusing on, and you're trying to do a more general risk base, that may not be the best way of looking at these things. Another popular way of starting a risk assessment is to start with a vulnerability assessment, because that's easy to do. I mean, we got tools and stuff out there, like this e-commerce thing we're talking about. Well, that's going to involve a website, so we're going to take a vulnerability assessment tool, we're going to run it against the website, and it's going to come up with these vulnerabilities, and now we can use to drive that, our particular risk assessment, starting with that, to look and see how these vulnerabilities might be taken advantage of to create risk. But I think that you should start out by giving serious consideration to this asset effect. Think about what it is you're trying to protect and what bad things could happen to it. And base your risk assessment on that, because unless your management has a lot of experience in looking at these crazy, these 3D graphs of kill vectors rotating in space, or they have a lot of experience in having somebody come in and talk to them about cross-site request forgery vulnerabilities in the website, they're not going to be able to relate to this too much. You come in and you tell them that, oh, okay, yeah, it's going to cause, somebody to come in and embezzle large amounts of money, or it's going to cause our firm, whose name relies a lot on its prominence in the community, to look like we're doing bad things in the community. The management is going to relate to that. They're going to be able to respond to this risk assessment that you're producing much more effectively. Okay, so once we've done the preparation, going through those preparation steps, we can now conduct the risk assessment. And in order to conduct the risk assessment, we're going to identify and determine the threats, the vulnerabilities, the effects, the likelihood, and the risk. Okay? We all kind of like pick up on a common theme here. And again, these will show up in any of the frameworks, but this is how it's going to show up in the NIST framework. So the first one we're going to look at are our adversarial threats. Adversarial threat sources and their events. And what the NIST framework suggests that you do is you consider the capability. Does this particular adversary, can they launch an attack or have a negative effect, instigate a negative effect on your company, on your asset, whatever it is that you're trying to protect? Do they have the intent? Basically this means, do they want to? What's in it for them? Okay? And then finally, targeting. If they do have the capability and they do have the intent, is there reason to believe they're going to come after you? Now, multiple threat sources can initiate a single threat event. Imagine things coming in from all sorts of places, having one sort of attack to try and get credit card numbers out, for example, or a given threat source. One particular malicious insider could get in there and cause all sorts of nasty adversary events. Credit card numbers and change credit limits on suppliers, and set themselves up as a vendor and things of that sort. So in order to keep that manageable, what I've seen organizations do is a lot of times they will categorize these things by what how an event is going to affect one of the organization's concerns. This gets back to what part of the organization are we trying to protect and improve on this assessment. For example, will it have a negative financial effect? This particular threat source event. And if so, okay, we're going to document that over here under negative financial effects. Is it going to have a deleterious effect on the organization's reputation? If so, okay, we're going to document that over here under reputation effect. Or would it affect the safety of employees or the public? If so, okay, we do that over here, and then we can look at each one of these in turn, and thereby do a little bit of the old eat the elephant one bite at a time sort of thing. So, when it comes to our e-commerce system, does anybody have any thoughts about what they think might be some adversarial sources for an e-commerce system? Who would have the capability, the intent, or want to target our little online widget selling system? Competitors. They might be very interested in knowing what we're doing, how we're pricing our widgets and how many widgets we're selling, what's going on. Very good. Identity thieves. That's another good one because you have to put a lot of, your customers are putting a lot of their personal information in usually in an e-commerce system, even this day and age. Maybe 5 years from now, some of that problem will be solved. Right now, a lot of personal information is, yes. Anybody else have any other good ideas?
Disgruntled customer.
A disgruntled customer might want to get in there and move up your e-commerce system. That would definitely be, that's what I hadn't thought about. The disgruntled customer. You win. Stress small. I like that one. I like that one. That's good. Disgruntled customer.
Disgruntled customers are up there.
Yeah, the disgruntled customers, yeah, they just want their widgets shipped. This disgruntled one can come after you in a number of different ways. Now, another thing that you might have heard about in some other talks here today that has to do with how we would go about now documenting this and setting these things up. If there's any number of vendors out there with a lot of products for correlating the different risk information, bringing stuff together. And I'm not saying that their products aren't worth it, but I will say that if you're just getting started out, like Mr. Kennedy said, just hold off spending $500,000 on your risk management, risk assessment, data collection software. Wait until you've got enough data together and you've worked through this process enough to know what it is that you're after. And then you can go look and see, okay, what product is going to best fit our needs? Because no one risk management product out there is going to be every organization's needs. I don't think you want to let the product drive your risk management or risk assessment strategy. So, for example, and you'll find this in NIST, this is their suggestion on how to document it. Spreadsheets. Okay, I guess that's how they're still running the federal government. We'll just stick this thing in spreadsheets. And this is excellent, for getting a start. And at the time that you're having your meeting, with, you know, the IT people and the business people, and you're brainstorming this stuff through, and you're asking these kinds of questions, and you're writing these things down maybe about, you know, the disgruntled customer and things like that are coming up. Yeah, just capture that information here in the spreadsheet and do that, like Mr. Kennedy says, for 12 months. And at the end of that, you'll find it's pretty easy to then transmit or transform this data that you've collected in the spreadsheets and put it into one of these, you know, $500,000 tools that will automatically do the correlation and set the dashboard up. Not that I've ever known a manager to actually have a list of those dashboard things, but if you've got one, you'll be able to look at the dashboard stuff and run the reports and all that other kind of stuff. But collect some data first. And as I mentioned before, I also think it's a good idea to consider non-adversarial problems because, you know, this stuff is going to happen and it's going to slow you down and it can cause, you know, the same degree of trouble to your business as adversarial stuff. Anybody want to throw out some ideas as to, in our e-commerce system, what sort of things could, non-adversarial things could happen? I got any imaginative ideas?
Natural disasters?
I'm sorry?
Natural disasters?
Natural disasters? Yes. You could get hit by, you know, tornado, or as I mentioned before, there was one shop I went to do a risk assessment at, and fortunately, this part that was, you know, the physical stuff was out of scope, but it really was in a room where the water dropped on the servers, you know, during a hard rain. It's just like, okay, you know, it's not in the scope of my assessment, but it's something that you might want to come back and think about. Either fixing the crucial unit servers, you know, there are some mitigating things that could be done here. I'm not sure you're really going to find that risk acceptable as it is. I also had a case where during an audit, we went in and looked, and we found that, you know, we set up the new e-commerce system, and it had been running for a couple of months, and we came back and looked at the procedures that were in place, and backups were running. The person who was supposed to set up the SQL backups for all the data had, you know, just hit the wrong button. And so all that order data, everything that was there, was something backed up, and anything going wrong, I don't know what they would have done. I guess they would just wait for the customers to call in and complain that their widget hadn't been delivered. And say, well, okay, I'm out of time to do you ordered this. We lost all our orders. Sort of like that. The AC going out, you know, there's any one of a number of things like this. And on this particular case, a lot of that stuff could be lumped together in one category, like, you know, like the tornado or the leaky roof and that sort of stuff. There's no need really generally for you to, you know, break those down and discuss each one of those in detail. You can talk about that as natural disasters. So we have that kind of see, you know, what would be the likelihood of that, and you know, how we might mitigate those risks. But
I'm sorry. Could you keep that? What about local disaster, like the power goes out because the places like don't work?
Yeah, power going out. Again, this could be a case where the risk assessment might not be so much intended to support the decision on risk mitigation as much as it would be on business continuity and disaster recovery. That might be a case where you calculate the risk of that happening, and you decide, okay, we're going to accept that risk as far as it happening, and then that will be dealt with by our business continuity plan or our disaster backup plan, or at the power. Maybe your only location is here in Louisville, and you say that, well, power's out here, it's going to be all over Louisville, and we're going to ship locally, so trucks aren't going to be able to move, so it's not going to be that big a deal. And again, first time around, just collect it simply. Again, particularly as long as you're talking about it, as long as you're doing these meetings like we are here, keep it simple. And another reason to keep it simple, of course, is so that your management will be able to understand it. Not that they can't understand complicated things, but if you can just present it in a simple fashion, they'll understand it a lot quicker. Okay, so we've looked at what are threat sources and events, both adversarial and non-adversarial, intentional and accidental, could be. And so now we're going to look and see, all right, where might our vulnerabilities be? And the vulnerabilities, the way this is done in the NIST framework is that you're going to be concentrating on those vulnerabilities that are vulnerable to your threats. If you have a vulnerability for which no credible threat exists, well, you don't have to worry about that vulnerability. So, going back to our e-commerce example, what might be vulnerabilities in an e-commerce application, irrespective of whatever controls, exclusive everything is controls? Just try and think about what might be a vulnerability that would have to be addressed as far as the severity and the likelihood. SQL injection, that's right, particularly through a web application. I'm sorry?
It's in between the client and the Commerce Act itself.
That's right. Somebody captures the data that's trying to get to the web app. All right, that sounds like it's stressful there.
Your network or your system is poorly configured.
A poorly configured network.
Notification, login.
Logins. There's another possible place for vulnerabilities. A DOS. Yes. Might be possible that this web app could be shut down. This is something that it's not built to withstand. Guarding the credit card information. There's credit card information in there, and yes, that also kind of leads to the PCI DSS. Kind of like it's kind of a cascading vulnerability because we've got an e-commerce system, it's got credit card information, therefore it's going to be subject to at least some level of PCI DSS compliance. And then there are penalties associated with non-compliance with PCI DSS. So you might even consider, because this is e-commerce, it deals with credit cards, and PCI DSS could be considered a vulnerability to your organization at this point. Something that's going to have to be addressed. The threat is that you end up non-PCI compliant. Vulnerability would be this need to be PCI DSS. Existing conditions also crop up again here with vulnerabilities. Maybe that's where you would put the PCI DSS question, because it would say what you're doing is subject to these regulatory requirements. Any other existing conditions that people might be thinking about when it comes to our e-commerce site, trying to sell our widgets along the line? I mentioned a couple of things a few slides back. Anybody remember what they were? No, not the I want. Does your organization have a particular architecture you have to you can't go out and just pick up any e-commerce web shopping site. You've got to pick one that's been approved by your executive technology committee, whatever that's fit within these guidelines, for example. Also, what sort of operational concerns do you have? Is this website going to be expected to sell widgets online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? If so, what might be some of the existing conditions? Load? That's good. I don't know who said that, but okay, that was a good one. Perhaps your contract with your tubes provider is such that they're not giving you a big enough tube, and that's all you can afford is that big a tube. And this new e-commerce system, could overload what you have there. So that could be a vulnerability to the e-commerce system.
Port information. For instance, you have an operating system out there that's not supported any longer by
for vendor or configuration management, if you've got something that is not supported, it could be that any e-commerce system coming in is going to have problems initially with what you've got. With what you've got because of some decisions that were made by your predecessor. 24/7. What if you don't have people who are around 24/7? What if you don't have anybody monitoring stuff 24/7? What if the people who are there are used to bringing everything down on Saturdays to run backups? It's just like, okay, well, we sell widgets on the weekends. These people are not used to your whole labor structure is set up such that they bring everything down. That's full use. That could be another existing condition that could be more considered a vulnerability about keeping your system going. I would be very hesitant to consider those people threats. I would call them vulnerability. Once we have these things, we work on determining the likelihood. And in the NIST framework, the nomenclature that they use here for adversarial threat sources and events, they ask that you consider what is the likelihood, and this isn't used in any mathematical or statistical sense, this is simply based on expert judgment. What is the chance of that event being initiated? For the non-adversarial or proof attacks, it's more of what's the chance of them occurring? Because nobody does the accidental stuff deliberately by definition. So, how are we going to determine this? Well, the first thing we need to do is we determine the likelihood of thing happening, either by initiation or occurrence, and then we determine the likelihood that it goes on to cause harm. Sometimes there will be mistakes, but if they happen at the right time, at the wrong time, which way you look at things, you don't end up having the harmful effect. And so that's not really going to come into our calculation of the likelihood. It's only where the likelihood of the threat and vulnerability causing harm goes together. Then that will give us the likelihood that we're talking about. So, who has some ideas as to how we might go about determining for adversarial sources, some of the things that we've talked about, the likelihood of initiation against our website? Yeah, I know you might say, well, no, I didn't calculate the likelihood of impact. But that's what we're asking here. Historical data. You could go and see, how many other e-commerce sites seem to have been hacked recently, and has it been done? Did it involve the particular vulnerabilities and threats that we talked about? That would be a good way. Of course, the problem there is past performance is not always an indicator of future results. but that's one good thing to start with. Is it?
Is that a penetration test to see how your system's configured?
Penetration tests can help come up with the likelihood there. You can see if, particularly if you are doing a threat or a vulnerability, well, actually anyone that's doing a threat to vulnerability of the asset, depending on how the penetration test is set up, although the penetration test is usually set up as the threat type of assessment. But that could give you some idea as to what the likelihood would be. That's a good one. I hadn't thought about that one, so I'll give you I'll get you back there in the back row. Stretch wall.
How about some monitoring to see who's trying to hit your website?
Monitoring to see who's trying to hit your website. Well,
For non-standard channels.
That's got, I'm not going to argue with that one, but I'm going to have to tell you I tend to side with Mr. Kennedy on that one, in that what you're going to pick up in that case are going to be the initiations that tend not to lead to the harmful effects. It's going to be, the ones that you're trying to calculate are the ones that get through, the ones that your monitor doesn't catch. That might be a bit much for our little company's widget website, but it's a good answer. It certainly justifies it. NTT data stress ball. Yeah, these are all, shameless plug for or rather the company I work for, the company. We could review blogs, industry reports, expert prognosticators.
How well known whatever website it is to.
That's right. If we go out and we buy a package, sometimes that's you're right. That can work against you. If you're buying something that is very common, then you're going to be a common target. Or if you buy something that's a one-off, then it could be harder to get into just because of that. For the non-adversarial, that's where I think your historical occurrence is probably the greatest use there. You just look at your history of who funds. If, for example, if that person at that one engagement I was at had a history of forgetting to set up the SQL backups every time the new system came in, then we could say, all right, well, next time that happens, there's a good chance that she's going to forget to do it again, so we need to make a note of that, so that's a high likelihood occurrence. In fact, I think they actually did that. All right, and then finally, you have to determine the effect. Well, what's the harm that's going to happen given that particular threat, vulnerability, the likelihood? What's going to occur here? For example, and these are the categories that you'll find in the NIST specification. Harm to operations. What would that mean for e-commerce owned widgets? Sorry? That's right, you can't sell anything, that's one. That's probably your biggest one. Yeah, you can't sell your product.
Reputation.
Hurt your reputation, but I would put that under assets. Your company's reputation is probably considered more an asset than something that's operational. But yes, that is entirely correct. Anything else under operations? Well, again, that would be affecting your ability to sell, but other than the ability to sell your product or ship your product.
It's not your product, you're an inventory issue.
Could have an inventory issue. Also think a little bit broader here, contractual obligations. You may start falling, like you say, your inventory issue may be because you cannot now get that stuff in that you said that you were going to be buying. Or you find yourself no longer PCI DSS compliant. That would definitely be a harm to operations. Harm to individuals. Somebody had this one earlier, I don't remember who. Identity theft, very good. Harm to other organizations.
B2B data.
B2B data could be stolen. Again, also the failure to meet the obligations, the lack of trust between organizations if all this stuff started falling apart. And how bad could these be? In the case of an e-commerce website, could be pretty bad. Yeah. This is not stuff to be simply ignored. So given all that, we can now determine risk. And generally, risk is the combination of the likelihood of the event and its harmful effect. You can start with this general definition. You can refine it as you go along. You can start out just with this real simple diagram over here. We got a low effect, high effect, low likelihood to high likelihood, and you just see which particular threat, event, vulnerability, effect combination falls into. Like the PCI, DSS non-compliance might not happen very often. If you're a small company, might not have that big an effect. If you're a big company, PCI DSS non-compliance can have more of an effect. Safety, could have a terrible effect there. If you've already got strained relationships with your suppliers, then you wouldn't want those to get any worse. Communicate the risk assessment results to the decision makers now that you've got your now well-documented assessment. And then maintain the assessment over time. This is where careful documentation of the process is going to pay off. A year or two from now, when it comes time to go back and look at this thing again, the next review and update is going to go a lot faster. You're going to be able to take off an update. You're not going to have to sit here and go through all this brainstorming over and over again. In the meantime, have that ongoing monitoring, like Mr. Kennedy talked about, so that you monitor the status of any changes to external threats, any new vulnerabilities that come up, so that the next time it comes back to look at this assessment, we can be updated very quickly and easily. So that's how you do risk assessments according to the NIST framework. Now, although it's not part of the risk assessment step, for the 2 minutes I have left, we're going to talk very quickly about responding to risk and monitoring risk, because it doesn't make much sense to just stop right there if you don't go ahead with those last 2 steps. Respond to risk. What are you going to do with this information? Well, the whole idea is that it gives you the ability to provide a consistent response to risk in accordance with that risk frame that we talked about earlier. You can accept risk, just take it as it is. You can mitigate risk, put controls around it to either lower the likelihood or lower the extent of the effect. You can share or transfer the risk. Notice that it does not make the risk go away. It's just as likely, it's just as bad an effect, but you get somebody to help you out with it, or you avoid the risk, whatever it is, you just do it. For example, it's just excitement. We're not going to sell it. Monitoring the risk, absolutely crucial. You have to ensure accountability. After you do this risk assessment, if you just put it in a drawer, it ain't going to do anything. All right, somebody's going to have to be made responsible to follow up with these items. They're going to have to put their name on it, and there's going to have to be some consequence if they don't. And there's going to have to be a periodic review to make sure that those things happen. Otherwise, it's not going to be taken care of, and the controls that you identified, if you have identified mitigating controls, are probably going to fail right when you need it. Give the management sign-off. That's what you shoot for since the very beginning. What can go wrong? Well, like any one-time thing, things can go wrong. I got some examples here, both fictional and non-fictional, where they thought they had everything figured out, and they thought they had all their bases covered, and it just didn't turn out that way. And that's fair. So the potential harm is high, but this is where that defense in depth that Mr. Kennedy talked about comes in crucially. But what can go right? I've got a list of things that can go right. It allows you to develop a repeatable, documentable process for assessing risk, responding to it appropriately, coming up with a process that fits your organization. You can plan actions to avoid problems. You avoid a compliance check-off mentality, your true security mentality. You avoid reinventing the wheel every time you come along. You establish consistency. You can establish some benchmarks and metrics around risk. You become more efficient. And by no means not the least, you can raise security awareness in your organization by getting people involved in the risk assessment process. Once they're involved in this process, they see what the threats and vulnerabilities and effects are, then they can much better understand why it is we're trying to put in the security stuff that we do. So, unless somebody has a good reason not to do risk assessments, I want to thank you all for being a wonderful audience here this afternoon, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day here at the InfoSec conference. Thank you very much.